This is a lecture to introduce you to apartheid. So this chapter on decolonization talks about the anti-apartheid movement led by Nelson Mandela. But before we start talking about the anti-apartheid movement, you need a basic understanding of what apartheid meant and where it came from. So the term apartheid, which is translated as separateness, was first used in 1917, but we get a very heightened sense of apartheid in 1948 and later after a nationalist party takes control of the government in South Africa. And this situation in South Africa is also often compared to segregation in the U.S. South. You'll see the same kind of separation of people based on their racial identities. And that one picture at the right side of the slide shows you Verwoerd. He was the Prime Minister of South Africa during this heightened period of apartheid from 1958 until he was assassinated in 1966. So South Africa had started out as a Dutch colony. We actually had it founded based on this placement of Cape Town here around the bottom corner of South Africa by the Dutch. The Dutch founded that town of Cape Town in 1652 as a way station for their sailors to disembark and reload with supplies so they could make it several more months to the Dutch East Indies, which are today Indonesia, but which were a Dutch colony and a very important trade point, a source of great wealth for the Dutch because this is where spices were stored and warehoused. So the Dutch claimed this area of Cape Town, but the British became increasingly interested, especially as they developed their own British East India Trading Company, which was trying to make it to India, and saw the Cape Town similarly as a convenient stopover point for the British East India Company sailors and soldiers. So there was a contest over Cape Town in the southern regions of South Africa between the Dutch and the British and the people who were already living there, the Khoisan. The Dutch reacted by moving in what was known as the Great Trek to the north and the east. And once they did that, they came into contact with the infamous Zulu, who you can see up there on the map, were living in a centralized, militarized state in Zululand under initially the leadership of Shaka Zulu. As the Dutch settled there, they actually moved a little bit inland so that they could avoid as much contact as they could with the Zulu because they lost several battles with the Zulu. And they centered their settlement in that area between the Vaal and the Orange River, where you see the city of Kimberley, and then also north of that. And what ended up happening is that diamonds were discovered in that region, and gold was discovered just north in what was known as the Transvaal, north of the Vaal River, which very much intrigued British investors, so that we have a war between the British and the Dutch. Actually a series of two wars, the First and Second Anglo-Boer Wars, which were won by the British and forced the Dutch to cede this territory. Now, the Zulu maintained a very centralized, strong, militarized state through much of the 19th century, although there were a series of battles in the 1870s where they finally signed treaties with the British acknowledging British oversight. So after that ceding of territory to the British, we have a British white government in South Africa that created a federation of states. The Transvaal, you can see there on the map, the Orange Free State, these were the areas with gold and diamonds. The Cape Colony to the south, which had initially been an area of Dutch settlement, and also Natal, which had Durban, an important port. And once they created this union government in South Africa, they began a system of institutionalized racial discrimination against the African majority. And this institutionalized racial segregation is what's known as apartheid. And it was trying to maintain white settler dominance over land and over the South African economy. So South Africa was a settler colony for the British. Colonists came over from Britain and settled here for generations. and made up a small minority of the population, roughly 10 to 14%. And between 1910 and 1936, in the early years, even before the term apartheid was known, we had the disenfranchisement of Africans. So increasingly, this small white minority passed strict education and property requirements that made it so that blacks couldn't vote. They also initiated a color ban in the mining industry so that certain supervisory positions were only open for whites. They passed the Native Land Act in 1913, which recognized that only 7% of the land in the Union of South Africa belonged to black Africans, and the rest of the land was recognized as belonging to the white settler minority. And so we have 83% of the land being given to this small minority, 10 to 14% of the population. We also have the introduction of pass laws, which forced black Africans to carry a pass, and you can see the picture there, at all times, which listed their tribal origin and the name of their employer if they were in the urban area. And if urban dwellers, residents, didn't have a valid pass, then they could be arrested, jailed, fined, or they could be forced basically into service for the state. They were given very low paid contract work, or they could just be expelled completely to a remote rural reserve. There was all kinds of resistance to these policies of the white minority. For instance, we had rural farmers who didn't want to have to dip their animals. Their animals were dipped in essentially insecticides to stop the spread of certain diseases, or people would flee from their homes to avoid paying the head taxes that the colonial state demanded of them. In the urban areas, workers went on strikes. In 1919 and 1920, there were huge anti-pass demonstrations and also strikes of mine workers. Some 40,000 mine workers unified together to go on strike in Johannesburg in 1920. And these attempts to improve people's situations and get rid of the passes were met with police violence, and then also workers were usually fired. And you can see in your book that we do have some political activism emerging also in the 1920s. So we have the formation of unions such as the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, which was started by dock workers in Cape Town. And then we're going to have a political union, the African National Congress, which was formed in 1923. And this period of resistance is going to get even more intense after World War II because South Africa underwent amazingly fast urbanization. And in response, we have that white minority growing increasingly fearful of urban black African populations, so they try to clamp down even harder than they had previously. So post-World War II, we have the rise of this nationalist party, this white minority, white supremacist government in South Africa, and they're going to get increasingly stringent and try to control access to land and South African economy even more. And there are some things, there are a lot of things they tried to do this, and I'll mention some of them. So with the Bantu Authorities Act and the Group Areas Act of 1951, what they did is they set aside certain homeland areas, rural reserves in the rural areas, and they said that every black African was a citizen of one of 9 different African ethnic groups. So that each person who was a black South African had a homeland, and he or she was supposed to live in that homeland. And it made black South Africans essentially citizens of these homelands and not of the greater South African state. So when black South Africans tried to leave their homeland, they required a passport. The move here also to create homelands was intended to give only the poorest land, the least agriculturally productive land, to black South Africans. So this was a clampdown on the mobility and also the economic prosperity of black South Africans. We also had the Bantu Education Act, which took government control of the education system, which had been run mostly by missionaries. and it forced Black South Africans to attend government schools. And in these government schools, they were taught in their supposed own language according to which homeland they came from. So we have some people learning Xhosa and some people learning Zulu according to what their passport said their ethnic identity was. And it emphasized ethnic difference, and it taught them only the bare minimum of what they needed to know to be able to work under white supervisors. And it taught them that they're racially inferior. The Nationalist Party also banned sexual relations between the races. It segregated public places. If you remember back to the very first slide in this PowerPoint presentation, everything with restrooms, public places, beaches, schools, everything was segregated. It restricted the positions that Black South Africans could have in the workplace. They were made to be members of the low-paid working class. It banned trade unions. And it also had a systemized pay scale that had white workers receiving 10 times the pay that black workers made, even if they did the same job. So there was a pay scale that was based on race. So what I'm hoping you can see before you do the reading on anti-apartheid movements is that for the black majority in South Africa, apartheid meant that they couldn't vote, that they couldn't own land, that they had to carry passes, that they weren't allowed to leave their homelands, that they couldn't move around freely, that they weren't allowed to strike or protest for better working conditions. Everything they tried to do to better their situation was met with very brutal repression by white police forces. And if you want to watch the news clip that I've included here, this shows the Sharpsville massacre of 1960. And what happened in Sharpsville is that there were hundreds of demonstrators who were protesting, and the police fired into these unarmed civilians, killing 69 and wounding 180 of them. So you can watch the news clip if you'd like to see this brutal police response to a peaceful protest. So you should understand that this anti-apartheid movement was a long time in coming, that Black South Africans had faced generations of repression and seen all their rights taken away. We have attempts to politically organize and strive for equality in our anti-apartheid movement.